Hi Year 12s. We're moving on now with kind of the last section of area of study 1, so the information that you need to know before the SAC. And just a reminder that the SAC will be Friday of week 7, so not this week, the week after. But over the next week, we need to go through these 4 things, and then also we'll do a bit of revision next week, and I'll upload a practice SAC. But the final thing is looking at the implications for health and well-being. So we're really focusing on health and well-being here of a few different trends. The 2 we're going to look at today are climate change and also conflict and mass migration. I just want to warn at the start that some of this can be a little bit confronting, especially the information around conflict and mass migration. And obviously, because we're doing this remotely and not in class, it's a bit harder to have those conversations around that. So if any of this does make you feel a bit anxious or upset, or you want to talk about any of it, please do let me know, and I'm happy to have a chat with you. There might be a few of you as well that even just want to talk about some of the themes that come up. Right, so we're going to start with looking at climate change. This is probably a topic you've looked at before in other years, in other subjects, but it has a really, really big impact on health and well-being, which is why we're going to look at it in this subject as well. It's very rare that you'll get a question in a health exam that asks like what climate change is or how it's caused, but it's always good to just recap this. So climate change is largely due to the huge increase in carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions due to the burning of fossil fuels. So things like coal, oil, gas, so all those things that we use for energy, the non-renewable things, have a huge impact on climate change. I guess in a kind of nutshell, in the way that we're going to look at it, so increased carbon dioxide causes increasing global temperatures, and you would have heard the term global warming a lot, which causes the melting of glaciers or polar ice caps. And if all of that ice is melting, that causes rising sea levels. And those rising sea levels have a really, really big impact on weather patterns and also extreme weather events, which we're going to look at in a minute. These 2 are kind of, mentioned in the study design as what you need to be able to link to health and well-being. So we're going to go through and have a look at that. But it's widely considered that climate change is the biggest public health issue of our time. People might argue now that that's now become coronavirus, but it is a huge risk to all people on the planet. And by 2050, climate change is expected to be the cause of a quarter of a million deaths. Okay, so it is a really, really big issue. I just want you to jump in. There's a really short video I want you to watch, and then just answer question 1. Right, so we're going to quickly look at these 2 sections that study design specifies. So the first one is the rising sea levels. So again, because of the melting of the polar ice caps, ocean levels are rising. You don't need to know these rates, but they are rising at a rate of 3 millimeters a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but over time that really adds up. And if the rate of melting doesn't change, it's estimated that by 2100, is that how you'd say it? Yeah. In 80 years, basically, that they would have risen by a metre. And that is a big amount, especially if you think of how many cities and countries are at sea level, okay? Especially a lot of our Pacific neighbours are pretty much already at sea level. So you add a metre onto that and places are underwater, okay? So it is a huge, huge issue. It's estimated that this could cause the displacement. We're going to look at this word a bit more later, but basically forcing 150 to 250 million people around the world to have to leave their homes in the next 80 to 100 years. Okay, impacts on health and well-being are huge, but some specific ones you could mention are that the increasing water can cause the loss of huge amounts of farming land, which is going to massively impact on food supplies, which obviously you can then link to nutrition and physical health and well-being. Also, by having ocean water coming into contact with freshwater supplies, that impacts our freshwater supplies. Okay, remember, ocean water is salt. So if all of our rivers and lakes start getting ocean water in them, there goes fresh water. And we know how important safe and clean water is for health and well-being. The obvious loss of housing and shelter. So the amount of people that live at sea level, their houses will be lost due to flooding. And that will then cause the forced relocation of people. So people having to move either, within their own country, or for some countries, especially like I mentioned, the Pacific Islands, a lot of those places, there is no high land. The whole country could potentially end up underwater. It's a huge, huge, huge issue that could force people to leave their home countries. Okay, we're going to jump into question 2 and link rising sea levels to spiritual health and well-being. All right, the other one we're going to look at is the changing weather patterns. Okay, the general trends that we are seeing with the changing in weather because of climate change. On average, we're seeing increased temperatures. Now, of course, if you follow Donald Trump as your news source, you'll probably hear him saying, oh, but it's cold today, so climate change can't be real. Obviously, that is not how it works. Extreme weather can go either way. You can get really, really hot summers and really cold winters. Okay, it's not always one way, but in general, on average, temperatures are increasing. As a result of that, we're seeing increased levels of drought because there is less rain. Okay, and then the science of it is very, very complex, but these changes to temperatures and drought and changing weather patterns cause increasing rates of natural disasters. So we have things like fires, which obviously we're all very, very aware of after the awful summer that Australia went through at the beginning of this year. In other areas of the world, and even in Queensland and Australia, we're seeing lots of flooding. In America, you see these huge kind of hurricanes happening each year. There's huge cold snaps happening in Europe, so major glacial events. We've been seeing things like tsunamis. Okay, these are all natural disasters that can be linked to changing weather patterns. Again, huge amounts of impacts on health and well-being, but some good ones to focus on to do with changing weather patterns. Increased temperatures often means increased infectious disease. Pathogens really like warm weather, and they like kind of wet environments. So if you think about a flood or a hurricane in a tropical region that leaves huge amounts of water all over the place, think about how much mosquitoes might like that. And what do mosquitoes often carry? Things like malaria or dengue fever, okay? Also, things like cholera that lives in stagnant water that can be found unclean water, okay? So infectious diseases are very closely related to changing weather patterns. Homelessness. Obviously, if people's homes are destroyed either due to ongoing things such as drought and issues around that, or natural disasters, so fires, floods, all of those kind of things that can wipe out homes. Of course, huge rates of injury or death from natural disasters. I mean, the Boxing Day tsunami in Indonesia in the early 2000s killed 250,000 people. Okay, that was one tsunami in one day. Okay, there's huge rates of injury or death from these disasters. And of course, similar to with the rising sea levels, seeing huge amounts of loss of crops and of water supplies. So the impact on food can be huge. Okay, so this time I want you to link changing weather patterns to physical health and well-being in question 3. All right, we're moving on to the second point now, which is conflict, war, and mass migration. Okay, like I said, some of this can be a little bit upsetting. There are a few videos that I want you to watch on this. So if you are kind of, feeling that you want to chat about any of this, please let me know as soon as possible. So just a bit of background. Around the world, at the moment, conflict levels, so kind of we're talking about war here, whether that's internal, which is often referred to as civil war, which would be kind of things that are happening within a country. So a really, well, not a good example, but an example that's talked about quite a lot these days is the Syrian civil war, the civil war happening in Syria. Or it can be between countries as well. But around the world, conflict levels are the highest that they've been since World War II, which is really, really, I think, devastating to think that despite knowing how traumatic war is, it continues to happen at a really high rate. There's also the added complication more recently of terrorism, which kind of is a newish thing that kind of really only started in the last 20 to 30 years as something that is talked about a lot. But terrorism has absolutely increased around the world. And often terrorism, the whole idea of causing terror is really horrible. And often it's targeting things like healthcare facilities or schools, places that kind of traditionally were, even in war and conflict, there were almost kind of unwritten rules that, you don't target children or you don't affect schools. And those kind of things have changed. Because of these high levels of conflict and of terrorism, the numbers of refugees and displaced people, which we're going to look at more in a couple of minutes, is also the highest it's been since World War II. And I think it's really important to note that low-income countries are overwhelmingly, disproportionately affected by conflict. Okay, so they tend to be the countries that are in conflict themselves. They're also the border countries. So if you think about, again, we'll look at this more in a few minutes, but if people have to flee their country because of war, what do you think the first country they go to is? They're often not able to get to a plane or to a ship or anything like that. Often the first place they will go is across the border into the neighbouring country, which, if that country is also very low income, their ability to support is really low. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So what I want you to do is to have a think here of how conflict and war can impact on each of the dimensions of health and well-being. Okay, I put links to 2 short videos in the Google Doc. They're only 2.5 minutes each. Please watch them because they do explain a couple of things quite well, and then complete the table. If you're really, really stuck, on page 437 to 438 of your textbook, it has a few paragraphs that explain these. But for example, if we're looking at physical health and well-being, so obviously conflict can mean an increased rate of injury, physical injury from shooting, for example. It could also lead to malnutrition due to decreased food. Okay, so I want you to try and link each of these dimensions of health and well-being to 1 or 2 factors of war. Right, so as I mentioned, there's a few different terms that are worth knowing, and they do kind of have different meanings. So a refugee, which you've all heard the term, a refugee is a person who has fled their country, so they've left their own country and crossed an international border to find safety in another country. Okay, so this is often due to war or to a huge disaster, and obviously people are leaving in panic. They very rarely have little with them, and they often don't know when or if they'll even be able to return home. Asylum seekers are it's slightly different. So they are refugees. They are people who have fled their country, but their request for protection in another country hasn't been processed yet. So if we look at Australia, for example, Australia is very interesting because we are an island. It's much easier to control who comes in and out of the country because most people arrive on a plane. So generally, a refugee who arrives in Australia has had they've been granted refugee status by the Australian government. This is all run through an organisation called the UNHCR, which is a branch of the UN. But let's say, a refugee. So I'll use the example of South Sudan. There's a lot of people from South Sudan came to Australia as refugees. Most of those people would have spent years in a refugee camp, often in Kenya, which is run by the UNHCR, and then countries will accept a certain number of refugees per year. So Australia took, based on a list of people and how long they had been there, people were granted refugee status and they arrived to Australia with a refugee visa. Asylum seekers are people that have not been able to have their processes claimed, or maybe they didn't have a refugee camp where they came from. And so in Australia, that is often people that arrive on boats. And I just really want to clear up an awful term. If you listen to the Australian media a lot, you'll often hear the term illegal immigrant. That is completely false. They are not illegal immigrants. They are people seeking asylum. If someone has left their country out of fear and they have requested safe asylum in Australia, they are not an illegal immigrant. They are an asylum seeker. And it is a human right. This is really important. It is every person on Earth's human right to seek asylum. Okay? If someone is unsafe, they have every right to seek asylum. There's also internally displaced persons, which we looked at previously, so IDPs, people who have stayed within their country. And then finally, there is what is called stateless persons. These are probably people in the worst situation globally. They are people who do not possess any nationality. Okay, and if you think about that, that means they technically do not belong to any country. They don't have any protection in any country. They have no rights in any country. You may not remember, but before we went online, we looked at an example of the Rohingya people who are traditionally from Bangladesh, but they are not recognised in Bangladesh. The government refused to recognise them, so they fled to Burma or Myanmar, where they're also not recognised. So they're stateless people. They don't legally belong in any country. Right, the last thing I want to just kind of explain before you have a look at a case study is if we're looking at refugees and asylum seekers, where do they go? And I think, obviously we hear our media, which, is only interested in what happens in Australia. And if you listen to the Australian media, they will make out like, every refugee in the world comes to Australia or wants to come to Australia. The reality is the majority of refugees go to their bordering country, which I mentioned at the start. So if you look at the list here of countries that host, so the major host countries of refugees, have a look through the names of those countries. You're not going to see many high-income countries in there. In fact, the only high-income country in there is Germany. And that is because Germany, a few years ago, hugely increased their refugee intake and basically allowed an enormous number of Syrian refugees into their country. Okay, but Turkey, Pakistan, Uganda, Iran, Lebanon, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Sudan, Jordan. These are all low-income countries that already have trouble providing for their own citizens and now have to try and look after a huge amount of refugees as well. This kind of shows a similar thing, but by high and low income levels. So this is looking at the number of displaced people in millions. So we look at the high income countries. Don't worry about the OECD things. High income countries are taking very, very, very few refugees and asylum seekers compared to the middle and low income countries. Okay, so if you're starting to think about things like resources and ability to support refugees, you're on the right track. Right, as I mentioned, the last thing I want you to do for this lesson is to read a case study that I have written. It's about 1 page. There's a short video, it's about 2.5 minutes long. You may be aware, so Angelina Jolie is an ambassador for the UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Sorry, to remember that. But they basically are the administrative organisation for refugees around the world. So she has spent quite a lot of time in refugee camps all around the world. But this video is particularly about Burmese refugees in Thailand. Now, these are actually different to the Rohingya refugees in Burma. Burma is a country in Southeast Asia with about 100 different ethnic groups. And due to religious and racial persecution, a lot of them are not protected in Burma and they need to flee to bordering countries. So have a read through that case study, watch the video, and then just answer those few questions, and I will talk to you on Friday.